Calvin Ridley, Derrick Henry, and Austin Eckler could all be getting a big payday in free agency next week. But will a change of teams destroy their fantasy production? We'll hit on this on today's episode of Locked On Fantasy Football.
You are Locked On Fantasy, your daily NFL fantasy podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thank you for making Locked On Fantasy Football your first listen every day. We are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm one of your hosts, Michelle Magdziuk. When I'm not doing this, I'm a researcher and fantasy analyst over at NFL Network. And Vinny's not here today again. He'll be gone for the rest of the week. But I'm joined by the amazing Matt Okada, director of fantasy football at NFL Network. So co-worker of mine and also a very, very dear friend. Very excited to have him on today. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 if your bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. All right, today we have a really fun episode for you. So we have free agency coming up next week. So Okada and I are going to discuss free agents that could be leaving their teams now, because that's what we expect with them being a free agent, but it would actually destroy their fantasy value because they're in pretty much the best spot they could have been in last year. So let's start right off the bat here with wide receivers. And now that everyone's been tagged, the best wide receiver out there is Calvin Ridley, probably. But Okada, do you think that the Jaguars were the best spot for him and actually it'll be ruined if he goes anywhere else?
It's tough to say whether it's the best spot because Trevor Lawrence should have been and should be better than he was last year. And the whole team, including Ridley, seemed to miss out just barely on a bunch of big plays, big touchdowns. But here's the problem with Ridley. He got great targets year-round, almost every game, but he was so inconsistent. I think he had maybe 5 or 6 games where you were really happy with his fantasy production, and the rest of it was not just not great, but just mostly bad, and that's not good enough from a wide receiver one. So if he goes somewhere where, for whatever reason, the kinks that weren't ironed out last year, and obviously had a year and a half plus off, so maybe he does get a little bit more consistent in that regard, I could see him getting a little better. But Trevor Lawrence is a good quarterback. He got the targets. Both those things are mostly what you can ask for a top receiver, and we didn't get the consistency. So there's a lot more teams, I think, where his value goes down.
Yeah, 136 targets, the exact same as Mike Evans. And Mike Evans produced over 3 more fantasy points per game than Ridley. And you brought, the big thing here was the catch percentage, who's down at 55%. It was miserable. And can we put that on Trevor Lawrence? Because he is a pretty good quarterback. So I don't know. Is it on Lawrence? Is it on Ridley? Is it on the system? I know, people don't love their offensive coordinator over there. But at the same time, I can't really think of another spot where you're going to have a quarterback where people think, is really, really a good passer and to get this target share. But he is only 29 years old and he doesn't turn 30 until December. I was shocked by that. I assumed he at least was 34 years old, honestly. Not really. But I did think I was going to go look it up and he'd be 30, turning 31. So I am shocked he's only 29 and not turning 30 until December. So he still has time to be great with another team.
Yeah, and obviously he has had less tread, although it matters less to wide receiver than a running back, given the time he's missed. And he hasn't played that many seasons because he came in kind of old. He's actually played in 5 seasons and then had 1 whole year off. So is it a 6-year breakout situation? He's kind of broken out before. He's never really been the superstar I think he could have been. And I don't know if we see it anywhere else.
I think it's safe to say that we're going through wide receivers here that we think will not be good on their new team, except I think we have to put the disclaimer here, except if they go to the Chiefs and they play with Patrick Mahomes.
That's
right?
very fair.
Do not hold that against us if that ends up happening for any of these guys. We take it back because exactly how I feel about this next guy, Gabe Davis, right? And now he wasn't the best fantasy option at all. He was very inconsistent. He had huge weeks and then weeks he got you 0 points. But the thing with Gabe Davis is he's just that one trick pony. He can go deep, and he was with the best quarterback that you can ask for that. He probably has the biggest arm in the league. And Gabe Davis did lead the NFL in yards per reception over the last 3 years by a decent chunk among all players with 200 plus targets. But how is that going to get a better situation for him than playing with Josh Allen, unless he goes to play with Patrick Mahomes? But besides that, it can't get any better.
Yeah, I really don't think it can. And I will even say, and this might be a bit of a hot take, I will even say that going to the Chiefs might not make him what we all want him to be. Because, like you said, he just kind of is what he is at this point, which is he's going to score a decent amount of touchdowns. He scored 6 or 7 touchdowns every year he's been in the league. Now, that was playing with Josh Allen, who's thrown a lot of touchdowns most of those seasons. If he goes anywhere else and gets a smaller percentage of the touchdown share, then we're going to see a big drop off there. But yeah, he does what he does. He gets the deep ball. He makes great plays. He's kind of I've recently heard, I think, someone call him a rich man's MVS. So maybe the Chiefs is the right spot, but MVS was beyond useless for fantasy. Yeah. So even if he's a rich man's MVS, maybe that I think that's honestly pretty much a lateral move for him, and anywhere else is going to be a drop off. And the worst part about Gabe Davis for fantasy and what we're talking about with free agent busts is I think if he goes somewhere else, a lot of people are going to be hooked into okay, he's out of that spot where for some reason he didn't get as much target share or usage across in every level of the field as he should have because he's a good receiver. And now he's going to go somewhere else and he's going to have a little breakout. And I just don't think that's going to happen. No. And I don't want to be hooked into that.
I don't think he probably would have got a chance with most teams, right? He's a 4th round player. He got the most chance that a lot of these guys drafted in that round who haven't been consistent at all is going to get. I do think his time is pretty much up. Hopefully he gets a pretty solid payday because I think he's going to be a disappointment at his next team and won't get another payday after that.
It's also worth remembering sometimes as fantasy analysts, he is a great player for the football team. What he has done for the Bills is great. The huge games he can have to carry that offense when other pieces aren't working, and just the field stretching that he brings in general, even when he's not getting the ball, those are very valuable. So a team will sign him and use him for their purposes well, and it just might not translate to fantasy, and we have to be willing to accept that.
Yeah, and kind of like MVS, right? If he could just catch a ball, he would have been really solid for the Chiefs because he can get open. He does create space, but there was just no way they could pay him that amount to keep dropping huge balls in huge moments. He did come through for the playoffs, though. I will give MVS that, but he's no longer on the team. So maybe Gabe Davis takes a spot. It's the only place I would even consider, him as a upside fantasy option next year. Besides that, I just don't think it's going to be pretty. And then last up, Marquise Brown. So, he got the team all to himself these last couple of years, mostly, right? Especially last year. It was him and Michael Wilson, a late round rookie, and Rondale Moore, who's been a disappointment for a couple of years now. That was it. And Trey McBride. But at wide receiver position, he had it all. Now he did only get to play with Kyler Murray for a few games there, right? A handful of games. But can it get any better than 101 targets and 14 games played for Marquise Brown? Maybe the situation can get better, but I do think the Cardinals pretty much as good as it gets for him in terms of what the volume he can get in any given season.
Yeah, I think Marquise Brown is going to be a big trap player because I think that a lot of people are going to make some of the excuses that you pointed out. He didn't get to play with Kyler Murray as much as he could have. There were some other players that popped in and took targets, but he's not made to be a number one. And I understand that the NFL is changing. The opportunity for 5'9", 180-pound guys is becoming a little bit better at the wide receiver position. But we've seen now 5 years of Marquise Brown getting four of those years getting 100-plus targets. He has topped 1,000 yards once, and it was 1,008, and it was 3 years ago. So I don't think you're ever going to get wide receiver 1 numbers for Marquise Brown, and I'm afraid that if a team signs him with the intent of that, fantasy managers will be again looped into thinking that. I think he's well suited as a wide receiver 3 for a team, field stretcher, and he'll have some decent games for fantasy, but not be someone you're drafting in the first 6, 7, maybe even 8 rounds. I'm going to be pretty much out on him. I think just about anywhere he goes.
Yeah, I will say when he was leaving the Ravens and going to the Cardinals, I actually had high hopes for him because I thought he showed some talent with the Ravens. And I was like, oh, he is a talented guy, maybe like in a more stable system. I guess he hasn't had the most stability over the last couple of years, Kyler Murray tearing his ACL. But like, this is me talking myself into him again, like you just said that people will do. So it probably will happen. But yeah, he probably won't be anything with his next team
And
again, unless
we
he
all
lives
had
with
the
Patrick
the
Mahomes.
Oklahoma thing too when he
Yeah.
came to play with Kyler Murray, and we were like, "Ooh, Kyler's gonna love him because they used to play together." And we've seen games of it, but not seasons of it.
Yeah. And our next segment, we're going to get into the running backs that could be changing teams. Guys, Tony Pollard, one of them that, Austin Eckler, guys that went very early in your fantasy drafts and did disappoint last year. But is it going to get any better if they join a new team? Okada and I are a little bit worried about that. So we'll hop into that in our next segment. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Get buckets with your first bet on FanDuel, America's #1 sports book, because right now new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 if your bet wins. Bet on all your favorite NBA players and teams with quick bets, live same game parlays, exclusive props, and more. To get in on the action, just sign up at FanDuel.com/locked-on and get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. Visit fanduel.com/locked on and shoot your shot. FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NBA. So right off the top here, Okada, this is a guy that I had such high hopes for this year, and he really let me down. Tony Pollard, right? And I don't even know how we can say if he goes to another team, it'll be better because he played on the #1 offense in the NFL. He had 255 carries, 55 receptions. He had the 6th most touches in the league. How does it get better than this? It can't. And I cannot envision him going to any team and me saying, yep, this is it. This is the year that he's going to be a top, a 10 guy where I have faith in that take.
Yeah, the real tough thing with Tony Pollard is, I mean, you just listed a bunch of the numbers. He 1,300 total yards. How do you not have a good fantasy season when you have that kind of opportunity and you're putting together yards? And the answer for Tony Pollard is fortunately really simple, which was he was incapable of scoring touchdowns,
Yeah.
especially when he got touches inside the 10, inside the 5. And that's the worst part of it. It's not like he was getting vultured a lot by some goal line back. And if he goes somewhere else, where he would be free of that, he would score touchdowns. No, he was getting the opportunities. He was in the top echelon of the league in terms of red zone touches, but he just was incapable of scoring. And I don't think that was a Cowboys problem. I think that was a Tony Pollard problem, which is really unfortunate because I was right there with you. I think I had him ranked in my top 3 or 4
Yeah,
going
I
into
did too.
last season. And the touchdowns just let me down. And I think to your point, if he goes somewhere else, those touches and those yards are going to be, I would guess, his max. So you're not going to get any better than that. And I just don't see the touchdowns getting any better because he had those chances and didn't convert. So it's
And I
really
can't
tough to figure out where to rank him.
imagine a team signing him to be their lead back, right? Like
Yeah.
he's going to want some money, but you just saw him be a lead back. It wasn't helpful for the team. Is the team really going to pay up to bring him in as their lead back? I think he'll probably get a lower contract than he wants and be splitting a backfield with someone else. And I guess he was better in that situation with the Cowboys when it was Zeke and him, but like that's not what you want. You don't want to go from all this volume down to, splitting a backfield again.
Yeah, and for Pollard, it's really going to come down to what his ADP looks like. Because if he goes to a situation like that where he's splitting with a Zeke-like guy, and he's going in the 7th round, then yeah, that's great. I wouldn't call that a bust. I would expect he would return value on that. But if we're drafting him again in the 2nd, 3rd, maybe even 1st round, depending on the team he goes to, that's going to be a massive bust risk. And I will say, to your point, I wrote this actually in my Boom Bust article for NFL.com for free agents. Where he signs is important, but I think what he signs for is more important to fantasy. Because if a team signs him to a contract that says in the numbers you see, this guy is a RB2 on our team, or a 1B, or even a 1A with a David Montgomery type of change of pace back or goal line back, then you know to avoid Pollard unless his ADP drops drastically. But if he gets 13, 14, 15 million.
That's
Okay,
not happening.
the
That's
team might be
not
making a
happening.
bad choice. No, I don't think it is, and that's your point, and I think that's the problem with him.
Yeah, I don't know if any of these guys get paid besides one that we'll talk about last in this running back segment. But another guy I want to hit on is Austin Eckler. Another one. I mean, he was so good for fantasy the 2 years prior, right? So he goes early again, and that like everyone who ranked him high, it was reasonable, right? Like he was so good the 2 years prior. You could see the jump off. You could see that he could regress in touchdowns, right? That was foreseeable, but the rest of it, he's had trouble staying healthy, right? And his body hasn't been nice to him. He has a smaller back. And then the touchdowns weren't there last year because the offense was a disaster. But I don't know if there is a situation that he can go to. A, he's aging. B, he's never had more than 206 carries, right? So I don't think another team's going to sign him and give him carries. I think the Chargers would have done that. They had nobody. They had Josh Kelly like desperately taking carries because they needed any other body. And he got all the targets in the world because Justin Herbert just like dumped it off to him nonstop. And then there was always wide receiver injuries too that allowed him to get more targets. I think our days of Austin Eckler being a great fantasy running back are over, and especially if he leaves the team.
Yeah, I think it's almost certain that the days of his RB1 or RB2 overall days are probably over because he was putting up wild numbers both in yardage and catches and touchdowns to do that. And there was two huge problems last year with the Chargers. One, Eckler looked old. He looked old and slow. There were tons of clips going around. He did not look like the explosive back he was. Now, was that injury related or was that because he was getting older? That's the thing we're going to have to look for this next season. He looks like he's in great shape off the field, but we did not see that on the field. But then the other thing is the Chargers O-line was horrifically bad blocking for the run. So I think it's likely that he gets a better situation in that regard. It's just a question of, does he go somewhere they're willing to use him heavily as a receiving back? Because that's necessary. I'd like to see 90, 100 targets to really, really like him for fantasy. So if he goes somewhere where it looks like they're willing to do that, I could get a little more excited. Otherwise, it's going to be tough.
And I can't really think of an opening where he could get that. Maybe the Cowboys. It's
If
like,
they let Pollard walk
yeah,
and go for Eckler, it's possible, but
maybe the
they haven't.
Bengals if they cut Joe Mixon.
Oh, well, I'd like that if they cut Joe Mixon. I don't see them doing that. I just feel like he's like a stable piece of that
Ugh.
offense, and they're just going to
He's
keep
such
him.
a
But
waste of money. They can save so much money by cutting
they
Mixon.
could.
He's such a waste. Moving on though, Devin Singletary, he's also a free agent. Played with the Texans last year after playing with the Bills for the first 4 years. I mean, he did get a career high in carries last year with the Texans, 216, and that was with them trying to make Dameon Pierce a thing for the majority of the beginning of the season until they're like, okay, it's not going to work in our system, and they moved over to Devin Singletary. So they gave him a lot of work. He was in an offense that scored a lot of points, but he only had 4 rushing touchdowns, 0 receiving touchdowns. Never really been a great receiving back. Only had 38 targets last year, but if I think that Texans offense for him and that opportunity he got because Pierce was struggling, I don't think he finds another opportunity like that anywhere else where he's going to get even close to 216 carries next year unless somehow he goes somewhere and the guy in front of him gets hurt. Like that's the only way I see that happening.
Yeah. I mean, incidentally, that's kind of what it took even in Houston this last year. Dameon Pierce was bad for the first half of the season, but it took him getting, I think it was an ankle injury, some lower body injury, missing a couple games, giving Singletary that chance. Then he looked really good. Then when Pierce came back, they still tried to give Pierce work again, but he was so bad. Then they finally said, okay, well, we saw what we got out of Devin Singletary. Let's just ride that. And he did look good and he did play well. But I like him. I like Devin Singletary a lot. I think he's good for what he is. I don't think that what he is a running back one for an NFL team. I think he's a great Tony Pollard to a Zeke kind of guy. Maybe a little bit less of a pass catcher, but that kind of change of pace, who's a really effective change of pace. He's always been efficient. He's going to move the chains well. There are some places I think he could go where if the offense is good enough and the guy in front of him, if there is one, is middling enough, like maybe if he went to the Bengals alongside Joe Mixon and they took a bunch of the, like if they brought Joe Mixon back and said, okay, we're going to stop giving you this many carries. We're going to give some Devin Singletary. He's in a good offense now. He's in an offense with a quarterback who opens the field up. I could get on board with something like that. But if we're drafting him, if his ADP is anywhere around what he did at the last half of last season, which is okay, he's really solid fantasy back. I think that you're more likely going to get a bust than a return on value.
Yeah. If the Texans don't end up re-signing him, which I don't think they will, I think they want someone that's a little bit, they can depend on a little bit more. I don't think he's going to be anything of next year unless there's injuries, right? And then one more guy, Derrick Henry. So there's a caveat to this. I think everyone just assumes he's going to sign with the Ravens. If he signs with the Ravens, I'm all in. I'm very excited for him. I do still think Derrick Henry has something left in the tank. I know he has so many touches on his body and carries, but like, I do still think he has another year left in him, but 349 carries in 2022, 280 in 2023. He was the entire offense these last couple of years for them. They've had nothing else since they traded away AJ Brown. It doesn't get better than that Titan situation. It can get better where he can be on a better team, but the volume is not going to be there like it was for the Titans. But if he goes to the Ravens, the volume doesn't have to be there like that. Everything will become so much easier for him than it was with the Titans.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And despite the fact that his volume will absolutely come down if he goes to the Ravens, because if nothing else, Lamar will take carries, but also they like to work in other backs. It does not matter at all because the field's going to be so much more wide open with Lamar Jackson throwing the ball than Ryan Tannehill / Will Levis. And so that's going to give I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I could guarantee you, I would bet my house that Derrick Henry has faced more loaded boxes over the last 6 years than any other running back in the NFL. If he goes somewhere where that's finally not the case, I think the efficiency that we saw drop off last year because he's getting older and the offense was so bad bumps back up. And we see that it go back to his, 5+ yards per carry. Those big runs that disappeared last year come back. And then the volume disappearing is okay. And also, Baltimore is going to get near the red zone a lot more than Tennessee did. That's going to be great for him. So I 100% agree. If he goes to Baltimore and loses 50, 60 touches, I wouldn't care. I still think he'd be great. If he goes anywhere else, just about, like, I'll talk to me again when we get there and we'll see who he signs with, what the offense looks like. But I can't imagine going anywhere else is going to make me excited because he's not going to get that workload and he's not going to have the offense. And most of those places are probably looking for a back that they can rely on because they don't have a great quarterback, which is what Tennessee has done. And that's not good for Derrick Henry's fantasy value.
And exactly how you feel about Derrick Henry, I feel about Kirk Cousins in his situation. The amount of volume he has throwing the ball, who he has throwing it to, and the situation he is in, it can't get any better. And we're going to tell you why. It'll be a disaster if he has to leave the Vikings in our final segment right after we hear from another one of our sponsors. Passion, drive, and patience. What brings home the winning trophy is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance, from superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home that win. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply, and eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. Kirk Cousins, man. Kirk Cousins just re-signed with the Vikings. I'm telling you right now. I mean, this is the one guy that's sitting out there right now that's currently a free agent. I know there's Russell Wilson and Baker Mayfield as well, but Kirk Cousins is the one that has consistently given us pretty good fantasy numbers over the last couple of years. I want him back with the Vikings. He needs to be back with Justin Jefferson and Kevin O'Connell's offense where he gets to throw so much. And there's no other situation that would even come close to me than the Vikings.
Yeah, Kirk Cousins is an interesting one because on the one hand, I think you're right. There is no place better. Over the last couple of years, he's been averaging, well, if you project his half of last season's numbers and then take the year before that, somewhere around 650 pass attempts per year. I think Sam Howell led the league last year, and it was maybe around 600, 610. So the volume is absurd, and it's going to perhaps one of the best wide receiver duos in the league. Obviously, the best number one wide receiver in the league. But with Addison there now, TJ Hawkinson, once he gets healthy, this is possibly one of the best, cores of weaponry that any quarterback has. The volume is among the best that any quarterback's going to have. And I think that it has elevated Kirk Cousins into a good fantasy quarterback where he's probably just average, actually. And so if he goes, I agree, anywhere else, his numbers are going to come down. The question there is, will everybody realize that and recognize that? Because he's not an exciting guy. I think that most people's perception of Kirk Cousins is more like what he is, which is an average quarterback, rather than the quite good fantasy numbers he's been putting up lately. So if he goes somewhere else, if ADP drops and he's quarterback 13, 14, 15, it might be doable. But if he goes somewhere else and people expect what we've seen from him these last couple years in Minnesota, no, I'm way out. Count me way out.
If he goes to like the Falcons or something, I am so out. I don't even care if he falls to quarterback 13, 14. Like, no, thank you. Stay in Minnesota. They don't even have they have Ty Chandler as their top running back right now. So they're just going to be throwing. And you love that for Kirk Cousins and Justin Jefferson. And then Baker Mayfield. So we could talk about Russell Wilson, but I don't think he's going to be a bust if he changes teams. Well, we know he is changing teams because it can't get worse than it was with the Broncos, right?
Tough.
So if you want to have faith in Russell Wilson, wherever he goes next year, it can't be a bust situation because it can only get better, honestly. So with Baker Mayfield, though, I do think this is another quarterback. He was usable as a streamer, and he needs to stay with the Buccaneers, I think, to stay usable as a streamer. I thought this was a fantastic situation for him. Mike Evans and him clearly clicked, and then he also had Chris Godwin, and he clicked sometimes with K. Dotton as well. But also he has to stop changing head coaches, right? He needs to stay with the same head coach. That would be great for him. Now he already does have to change OCs either way, even if he does change team, or even if he does stay with the Buccaneers, because Dave Canales got hired by the Panthers. But still, this is the only spot that interests me for Baker Mayfield.
Okay, I'll throw out a couple other ones that I would be intrigued by. I think that staying in for the Bucs is the best because we just saw him get comfortable there and have the best season, one of the best seasons of his career. For fantasy, he was a QB1. I think in Atlanta, he could be decent because they have good weaponry. And unlike with Kirk Cousins, you don't get the massive fall off because he wasn't throwing a ton of balls. I think in Seattle, if they trade Geno Smith, which is something we've heard about a lot, that could be kind of interesting. You don't rely on the passing game. You have a good run game, but you also have good pass catchers. I think that could be fun. And then Washington, if they move on from Sam Howell and they go with Baker Mayfield, I feel like Baker Mayfield is better Sam Howell. No?
No, he is a better Sam Howell, but I don't think that's not a good spot for him in terms. I think it would just be a disaster. And he probably gets benched halfway. Like that's
a lot of picks.
I followed you with the Seahawks. I like that because DK Metcalf and him, I think they would have a similar, connection as to him and Mike Evans, and they have those other weapons. That could be interesting. I just don't see the Seahawks moving on from Geno Smith just to go get Baker Mayfield, right? Yeah. I love Baker Mayfield, but I wouldn't really get the point. I don't get the point of that. Maybe the Falcons, but also they could be going, drafting a rookie here. Yes. So Baker would then have to compete there. I think the Buccaneers are it, man. They're the 25th overall pick. They don't really have a chance for anyone else unless they go sign Russell Wilson. That's my worry for Baker. That could ruin. But I mean, I think Russell Wilson at this moment is a slight upgrade to Baker, right? And cheaper. That's the crazy part is Russell Wilson probably will be a lot cheaper. True. Then Baker.
The money is wild with Russell Wilson. Yeah, you can get something. We could see a crazy thing happen with whoever he signs with. So if they want to save money to go with Russell Wilson, I don't hate that. I really do like Baker. I think he's a solid quarterback who could win a Super Bowl in the right situation. So I hope that he goes. If he stays here, I hope that they build a decent team around him that can, get back to the playoffs and succeed. If he goes elsewhere, I hope it's one of those teams we just named so I can draft him for fantasy.
And then one last guy to hit on real quick. He's not a free agent, but Justin Fields. it seems like there's a very high chance that he's going to be switching teams. And I do think it's fair that we could list him as a bust option here with certain certain landing spots, right? Like the Steelers are a name that's popping up. I think that would be terrible for his fantasy
Oh,
production.
so bad.
Just so bad. The Raiders, I would hate it. Like I wouldn't like that. Really, the only landing spot that he can go to where I could see him shine would be with the Falcons because of
Yep.
he has Bijan, he has a good offensive line, then you do have Drake London and Kyle Pitts, and they could build upon that. I would like the Falcons landing spot. I don't really know if there's anywhere else I would be thrilled about Justin Fields for fantasy getting any better, or I think it would just get worse from his Bears day if it's anywhere else but the Falcons.
So the big thing with Justin Fields is most of his fantasy value is going to come from his legs. So whereas like a guy with Baker, the weaponry that he goes to matters a ton. I think it matters less with Justin Fields. He was still good before they had DJ Moore. Obviously that helped, and he was valuable for some games with DJ Moore in town. If he goes to the Falcons, I would love it. I would. He would immediately, like off the top of my head, be a top 6 quarterback. Maybe I could get him in my top 4 for fantasy because they have the weaponry. They have Bijan, which is great for a rushing quarterback because now you don't know who's getting the ball and what direction they're going with it. I think Justin Fields would be great there. Otherwise, I still think he'll be a QB1. Unless he gets traded to somewhere who has another quarterback and they trade something super cheap and get a huge, buy low on Justin Fields because the Bears want to move on to go to the future of Caleb. Then we're in trouble, maybe. But I think he's going to go somewhere where they expect him to be the starter. And if he does that, the rushing is king for me for fantasy. So I'll be intrigued. If
Even
we're
if
going to
it's the
draft the top
Steelers.
6, he has to go somewhere good.
The Steelers would be so gross. I know it's Arthur Smith
No.
and a play action, but
Nope.
I don't like the weapons there for Fields. I don't like that situation. I would love Fields as a Steelers fan. I would be excited to get him as a quarterback, but I wouldn't love the situation for him for fantasy, at least. That is it for today's show. Thank you so much to Matt Okada for joining us today. Thank you to all for making Locked On Fantasy Football your first listen every day. Everydayers, Okada and I will be back tomorrow with another super fun episode. Don't miss it. Bye, y'all.